This was the textbook for 6th grade life science that I was given to use at the Christian school where I taught. I ended up not using it very much because I had already developed teaching materials from another resource, and I was so overwhelmed with work that I had to lean on my pre-existing resources instead of learn this new book. Still, though, I matched my approach to the progression and complexity of content in the book, assigned some reading from it, and otherwise paid lip service to it as the official textbook. But it was middle school, and I tried to focus more on doing and seeing than sitting and reading. I kept an older, damaged copy at home, and did not return when I quit, so I don't have the table of contents or the first chapter. I have the last page of the first chapter, which indicates that it's just a run-of-the-mill introduction to the class with a middle school level explanation of the scientific method. The book is divided into parts, essentially units, containing short chapters, only a couple of pages each usually, that explain a main idea, present a list of key terms, and ask comprehension questions at the end. After the introductory chapter is what the Bible says about where living things came from. It's a straightforward summary of the literal interpretation of the creation story in Genesis. Not much to see here, but the questions are more informative than the text. Did fish develop into snakes, or snakes develop into birds? How do you know? This question I find fascinating because while snakes and birds are both tetrapods, which are all descended from lobe-finned fish, evolutionary theory doesn't say snakes are ancestors to birds. It might be trying to pass off as two arbitrary examples of animals, but it's subtly planting a straw man into the heads of kids. Does it matter to God if fish have babies that are something other than fish, or if people have babies that are not human? How do you know? This question is an old and tired anti-evolution line about an organism's offspring being a different kind of animal entirely, which violates evolutionary principles anyway. The expected answer reinforces the nebulous concept of a kind. What really creeps me out, though, about this question is people having babies that are not human. I have to wonder if this icky feeling isn't exactly what the question is trying to make the students associate with evolution. According to the Bible, is God still creating new plants or animals? Why do you say that? The literary answer to this question is no, because on the seventh day God rested, and creation is complete. The subtext to this question is that evolution constitutes new creation, so evolution can't be happening because God's not making any more creatures. This is an invitation to close your mind to new evidence by presenting you with a predetermined conclusion. Why would you listen to someone's explanation of a square circle? You already know it's impossible, so it's a waste of time. Even if they managed to sound persuasive, you can tell yourself that they must be deluded somehow, even if you can't pinpoint the flaw in their argument. What's really sad is that this chapter immediately follows the first chapter about the scientific method, which apparently we are just not supposed to be using. The next chapter, The Beginnings of Modern Biology, describes the complications of failed classification by simple appearance and the inconvenience of not having a universal naming system, and presents Carolus Linnaeus as the father of modern taxonomy, including the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species classification hierarchy, and the genus-species binomial nomenclature. The next chapter, Living Things, runs down the criteria for life. Typical chemical composition of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, being made of cells, using energy, getting that energy from an external source, reproduction, the tendency to grow. Living things have a normal form and size, and response to stimuli. The strangest one to me in that list is having a normal form and size. At first, it kind of looks like it's trying to reinforce the idea of limitations on variation within kinds, basically allowing for microevolution but not macroevolution, but it might also just be a dumbed-down version to say that life operates on a DNA basis. But what's really funny to me is that the example it gives for a non-living thing is a rock, right? Which could have different shapes and almost any size, as opposed to a living thing which has a particular shape and a particular size. As if there isn't an equally exhaustive system of classification for rocks. The next chapter, Some Other Observations About Living Things, is the last chapter in the first part, so it closes the introductory unit with some supplementary facts. A footnote encourages the teacher or parents of a homeschooler not to worry about all the details, but to focus on just how awesome it all is. It's supposed to be an enriching exposure to big ideas, a mountaintop view of the field before moving on to the big hike. The first one emphasizes that cellular functions are chemical functions and operate according to rules. It still uses religious language, saying that God has certain rules that tell atoms when and how they can link up with other atoms and when and how they have to stay away from each other, but it's surprisingly close to saying that organisms are physical systems operating on deterministic rules. But by specifically putting this in the context of cells, it leaves open the door that there's still some special spark of life that chemistry can accomplish more broadly. Zoom in on an organism and what's going on? Chemistry. Zoom out on life and what's going on? Not chemistry? The second observation is that animals fit their habitats. The text says well suited and then notes that scientists say well adapted. It doesn't outright say that animals were specifically tailored for diverse environments by God, but it does implicitly discourage the thought that natural variations of organisms endure selection pressures in various environments, and that the specimens you find in each environment are the ones whose genes make their proliferation more likely. It specifically calls out adaptation as a shibboleth. That's what scientists say. The third one states the law of biogenesis, that living things come from living things, but expands on that in a footnote, which I will read in its entirety. Strangely, though, no one has ever observed abiogenesis, beginning from non-life. Most modern biologists seem to think that, with no help from God, all the living things in the world today just started. They say evolved, from non-living things, from chemicals that were floating around in water. It doesn't even throw a bone to the Miller-Urey experiment and say something like, scientists have been able to produce a few organic compounds, but not life, or, but that only proves intelligence was required. No, it dismisses it as unobserved, otherizes scientists with the phrase, with no help from God, and the way it treats the term evolved, and mocks it with an incredulous exclamation point at the end. Look, I've seen a few Christian science textbooks. Some of them approach controversial topics and unresolved questions with tact and grace. This one is fostering an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific establishment attitude that is destructive to curiosity and eventually to people's faith. A chapter about what the Bible says about where life came from? Sure. It's Christian doctrine, and the text of the Bible is what it is. But this is just culture war, modern American Christianity nonsense. I grew up in this stuff, and it's embarrassing to see it like this and know that some people earnestly think this is a responsible way to teach kids. The fourth observation is that DNA is God's design plan for each organism, and that it's the basis for reproduction after one's kind. This is common, everyone's seen this, so there's not much more to say about it. It was hinted at earlier, but now it's explicitly stated. The fifth observation is just how big and complex DNA is. It goes into great length, no pun intended, about just how many letters there are in the encyclopedia of you, but thankfully doesn't take the opportunity to ponder how unlikely it is to arise by chance. The only anti-evolution statement it makes is to point out the mystery of why so-called simple organisms like some amphibians have longer genomes than humans. I don't know, that seems like more of a design problem? The last 5 observations are simple and don't present an opportunity to be anti-evolution, so I'm not going to go through them all. They're uncontroversial and only contain one token, God did it, that doesn't really affect anything. Because this is written for tweens, there's not a lot of technicality or depth. No fault there. But this is a developmental stage where kids are more and more asking, how come? and drawing connections between the facts they've been accumulating through their earlier grades. Now is the time to introduce large-scale systems to help them make sense of the world so that they don't just know that camels and giraffes both have even-toed hooves, but that those are heritable traits that put them in the same family tree. Or that it's just a designer's flair to reuse some of the same motifs in various creations. Evolution is a big idea, one that young kids struggle to grasp. Middle school is where their intellect has grown to the point where they can get up on their toes and look over the fence to see a much bigger world. And if you put ideological blinders on them here, you may have blinded them for life. Science is a way to see. It's binoculars or a microscope or glasses. No, it can't see everything. Science doesn't tell you to find nature beautiful or to find learning exciting. Religion is a part of human culture that can incorporate those intangible aspects of being alive in the world. But when religion tells you to put down the binoculars and put away the microscope and take off your glasses, it's hurting you and ultimately betrays its own interest in glorifying a higher power and appreciating our world. The rest of the book is largely standard fare middle school life science. It covers a broad range of the diversity of life on Earth, and as is to be expected, spends most of the time on plants and animals, especially familiar ones like mammals and flowering plants. Confusingly, though, there is no chapter on fungi or bacteria. I don't really have an explanation for that. The text still contains the odd jab at evolution here and there, but mostly it's just a straightforward report on organisms and their classification. Oddly, though, after making a big deal about naming conventions in the second chapter, it switches back and forth between common names and scientific names for orders and classes. For example, in the mammals, it uses technical names like Chiroptera for bats. But for birds, it says nighttime birds of prey instead of strigiforms, or just owls. Going through all these chapters in detail would be a whole video unto itself, so for now, this has been my review of Introduction to Biology by John Holzmann. I used to be a science teacher at a Christian school, and I'm sharing my experience and perspective on the relationship between science, Christian faith, and education. And if you like this video, please let the algorithm know by hitting all the buttons. All the buttons. Hit them all. Share this with someone who would like it, or even better, with someone who would absolutely hate it. And if you'd like to support this type of project, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I am still a full-time teacher, a profession famous for how fabulously wealthy we all are and how much free time we have to spend on side projects. This is a passion project for me, but if you think the world would be better with more of this, then please help me make it a reality. Thank you for watching.